thank you for this opportunity. And I just want to welcome everyone into this webinar and yeah, taking the time to listen to the story. And it's a journey, to be honest. It's a journey that we've been on with this particular project for a while. And I'm very fortunate to have been involved in it and look forward to sharing it with all of you. I just want to start with the context. So just starting off with where we are just within the South African context. So yeah, from a conservation outcomes perspective, I just wanted to give an introduction to who we are, and we have a vision to establish biodiversity-based economic ventures on private and communally-owned conservation and protected areas in an effort to secure critical biodiversity and contribute to meaningful rural economic development. So essentially, we operate in the landscapes outside of the state's sort of formal protected areas. We aim to create sustainability and conserve critically important biodiversity and associated ecological processes outside the state protected areas, contribute to meaningful, sustainable poverty alleviation in poor rural areas of Southern Africa, and also contribute towards rural development and land reform processes in an effort to create viable conservation ventures that redress some of the imbalances of the past. So importantly, we also look to from a wildlife economy philosophy perspective, we look to establish new communally owned protected areas that enable business development, job creation, and meaningful benefits for the land owning communities and also their beneficiaries. We also look to protect critically important remnant biodiversity and also contribute towards the maintenance of ecological integrity, resilience, and ecosystem functioning at a landscape level. We also ensure appropriate management of existing protected areas which meet the purpose for which they were established, and this can often be a challenge when you start looking into the long-term sustainability of a protected area. And then understanding the intrinsic link between sustainable human livelihoods and also conservation. So I just wanted to look at the current situation that we have particularly in the South African context. Unfortunately, we find ourselves in a situation where the conservation agencies are really battling from a financial perspective because of dwindling budgets, and then also just the costs of managing these protected areas, which are not necessarily and were never necessarily set up to be financially viable. So this is putting a huge strain on the protected area network, and it's creating the challenges, and it's the alternative from a private perspective or community owned is that we're looking to create ways to make them financially sustainable. And then obviously the COVID pandemic has exacerbated the situation and highlighted the sort of pitfalls of an over-reliance of tourism. I'm sure there's many of you have seen that, and there's lots of literature that's emerging around that point as well. Further to that is that it's predicted about 1/3 of South Africa's protected areas will be successfully land claimed in the coming years. So as a result of that, we have new co-management models developing and requiring different ways of doing the business in these protected areas so that those that own the land can benefit adequately. And then we got to look at embracing a collective economic approach in which protected areas are integrated into the rural economy and not seen as islands that are somewhere exterior to the landscape in which they find themselves in. And finally, a very important point is the context of human rights. And I think this point is pertinent to the case study and example that I'm going to be discussing today. Communities that live in and around protected areas that face daily risks to their survival and livelihoods from wildlife impact must not bear disproportionate costs related to conservation, but should be its primary beneficiaries. certainly in the province where I find myself in right now, in KwaZulu-Natal, some of you might have seen some of the headlines in South Africa, lions escaping and impacts to communities around the outside of those protected areas. And that is resulting in challenges when those people are being affected by the wildlife and they actually are the very owners of some of the land within those protected areas and are not necessarily seeing the benefits that can offset that impact. Furthermore, we just got to looking at the land reform context, and just again, this is pertinent to the example I'm going to be discussing today, is the rural development and land reform. Obviously, we've got a strong history of agriculture in South Africa that shaped the landscape, and in many cases, conservation historically had to try and carve out these tiny little pieces to conserve remnants of biodiversity. So it has been sort of dominated from a political perspective as well. But the problem is that only 12% of South Africa is arable, and only 22% of that arable land is considered high potential agriculture. And within that, 2.6% of South Africa's land area is made up of that. So we don't have a lot to work with from an agricultural perspective, and often that has pushed agriculture into marginal areas. 81% of the country's total area is used for agriculture, and 83% used for grazing, and 17% for cash crops. So the grazing component is important, and this is looking at traditional livestock agriculture. And we need to see how can we make better use of these grazing areas and also improve the quality of those grazing areas. Conventional agriculture is largely on marginal land, and challenges are ongoing, as not only in South Africa, in many countries where we find there is land degradation resulting from overutilization and obviously exacerbated by the impacts of climate change and the lack of ecological resilience. So that's where we look at wildlife economy, looking at species that perhaps are better suited to these environments or are complementary to those environments, to an agricultural environment. And what can we do in terms of developing a wildlife-based economy? And the reason for conservation outcomes, particularly looking at this aspect, is that South Africa and globally, there are targets being set. The HE targets were set, that they come and gone and were not necessarily met. We've got on the table the 30 by 30 targets, and how are we going to achieve that? South Africa currently has 16% of its land under some form of protected area status, and the target is to reach 28% by 2030. We're not quite going to reach the 30%. And then obviously, we're signatory to the international agreements, and there's the SDGs, and how can biodiversity conservation in particular contribute to us meeting the SDGs. So that was just to give you a context about, from a South African perspective, from an organizational perspective, why we are working in the wildlife economy space and where we see the opportunities and challenges. And I just wanted to today focus on one particular project that I've been involved in, which is called Babanango Game Reserve. And I'm going to take you through the journey of its development. I wouldn't say it's not developed yet, but it's a work in progress. But I think it's a unique example of the opportunities that we have in South Africa, and definitely a blueprint that could be expanded to other countries, particularly in Africa. So just in terms of what is Babanango Game Reserve? So it is a game reserve that is based in the province of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, as represented by the map. It's a malaria-free game reserve, which is being developed in protected areas that will sustain wildlife populations of many different species, including the aim of Big Five. The reserve is currently 20,000 hectares in size and is in the process of attaining statutory declaration as a nature reserve under the Protected Areas Act. And it has 20 kilometers of the White Umfolozi River running through it. It has a vision which is to enable the rehabilitation and restoration of biodiversity and conservation of wilderness through responsible tourism and resource use, such that lives of the community are enriched through the provision of employment and renewed sense of place and restored ecosystem services. It is a place of great beauty and significant biodiversity as well. It's in a position where it is transforming the area from a purely subsistence or quasi-commercial livestock grazing system towards one which is wildlife, and it is creating significant social and ecological benefits. So I'm just going to show you some of the pictures that give you a sense of the landscape. There's a great altitudinal variation as well, so very important from a climate change perspective, and also from a water source, a water conservation perspective as well. So this is the White Umfolozi River, where there were cattle grazing. The community were grazing their cattle in that area, and also there were people from outside the communities who were not necessarily beneficiaries also grazing their cattle in that area. That is transforming to the introduction of wildlife, but at the same time, the project has not left out the livestock component. So I just wanted to touch on some of the biodiversity aspects. Here's a map just to show you where it fits in. It is part of the Umfolozi Biodiversity Economy Node, which is, and this project is possibly the flagship of that node. There's 11 nodes set out in South Africa, which are identified in the National Biodiversity Economy Strategy. And this node I think there's a lot of potential for these nodes to play a strong and more active role in promoting and developing the wildlife economy. But at the moment, it hasn't gained as much traction as we hoped. Okay, so just some historical background to the development of the project. In 2012, the Mcagwini Community Trust, headed up by a person, Eric Buthelezi, wanted to see if they could set aside a portion of their land that they had successfully claimed through the restitution process in South Africa, if they could set aside a portion of it to become a nature reserve. They approached the state institution called Izimvelo KZN Wildlife to enter into the biodiversity stewardship program, which helps facilitate and assess land in the province to see whether it can attain or what level of conservation status it can attain. In 2013, a formal assessment was conducted, and the area that they assessed scored very highly, possibly the third highest score that has been achieved in the province from a conservation biodiversity perspective. Unfortunately, that's where it ended. And then in 2016, Conservation Outcomes and my colleague, Greg Martindale, who was involved in the assessment, felt that this was a very important part of the country, but also it was very important to see how we could take this land, which had been restituted in the hands of the community, and develop it into something that was beneficial for the community, whilst at the same time preserving its incredible biodiversity value. So in 2016 and 2017, conservation outcomes applied for different forms of funding. The aim of that funding was to try and get the landscape investor ready so that it could attract additional investment into that area. The funding was approved, and there were two different amounts of types of funding. One was around the employment of people from the Mqagwini community to clear alien plants, and the other one was to fund infrastructure development. Unfortunately, there were some challenges from a government perspective, and some of that funding has yet to materialize. As a result of that, we felt that there was a concern that the vision of the community might be waning, and the interest in it, particularly when you're trying to get people to buy into a completely different economy. This rural landscape is accustomed to, as many of you would recognize with, livestock is the main economy in this area, and many of these people have never derived any form of income from the ownership of wildlife or any kind of investment into wildlife. So selling the concept of creating a nature reserve was quite difficult. In addition to that, the area still had a large number of cattle grazing across the entire landscape. So again, from a biodiversity perspective, you can see the macro planning corridors in terms of the ecological corridors. The reserve fits into squarely into the northern interior biodiversity corridor. So it was a good fit and obviously into the state or the provincial conservation agencies' planning. Looking at some of the habitat types, as I mentioned, it is a very diverse environment. It has altitudinal diversity going from 1,400 meters in the southwestern corner to 650 meters where the Umfolozi River exits the reserve in the northeastern corner. A critical biodiversity type is the Midlands mistbelt grassland, where there is a underrepresentation of that vegetation type being conserved. So what happened then was in 2017, conservation outcomes went out to try and source private investment to develop the vision of the Mqagwini community. What happened was that the Mqagwini community assigned an area of about 13,000 hectares to the game reserve, and then in addition to that, there was a private investor who came on board after doing a feasibility study of the area and its potential, particularly from just a tourism perspective. The investor felt that it was an opportunity to collaborate with the Mqagwini community as landowners. After 2018, the private investor also became a landowner and bought up additional land adjoining the Mqagwini Community Trust land. Further to that, interest was shown from other communities, neighboring communities, the KwaZulu-Natal community and the Isibongweni community, who also wanted to put in a portion of their land, a much smaller portion of land. And then there was also some government land that joined the site, and I'm just going to switch to the map and you'll have a better understanding. The blue area is the Mqagwini community, the red land is the private investment, the light blue is the KwaZulu-Natal community who put in some land on the side, and then the Isibongweni community on the eastern side, and then the green is the government portion of land. And that is what makes up Babanango Game Reserve, the fenced area of Babanango Game Reserve today. In terms of the collaboration, we have Babanango Game Reserve and the African, which falls under the African Habitat Conservancy. It's a Pty Limited company who have lease agreements with the Mxagwini community, the Kwangono, Isibongweni communities as well. And then there is state land, and the leasee of that land has assigned a portion of their land, which was also used for grazing, into the reserve to diversify their economic interests. And then there is a foundation that works with the communities around the reserve. This just gives you an understanding of the land holding, the Mxagwini community properties. So not all of it is shown here, but you can see not all of it is included in the reserve, and that the hashed area is what is going to be proclaimed under the Protected Areas Act, or that we're working on at the moment. So what has happened to this date? So from July 2018, when the project really started, there has been a lot of work that's had to be undertaken. One is obviously to balance up the interests of trying to generate income, but also to generate value for the landowner. So there has been 2,300 head of animals introduced since 2020, and there's plans for the big five. A couple of the big five species are already on the reserve. From an infrastructure perspective, there's 2 lodges have been refurbished. One is on community land, and there's also an environmental education camp and facility on private land. But there is a new 5-star lodge which is under development at the moment, which is also on community land, and that's right on the Umfolozi River, and that in itself is about 180 million rand investment. So that will come online soon. So a lot of value added to the landscape. Additional infrastructure, there was a bridge that has been built across the river, no small investment there. At least 78 kilometers of boundary fencing erected, and that is 2.4 meter game fenced, electrified. So also no small investment. 2 fully functional workshops in the north and the south, and a lot of staff accommodation has been built, brand new staff accommodation as well. And also then the improved road network. All of this has been an investment into the landscape, and it certainly improved the value of the land owned by the communities. So to date, there's been a total of about 320 million rands worth of investment. If you're looking to convert that to dollars, just divide that number by 16, and that will give you the US dollar amount. There's a further at least 200 million rand investment just on the infrastructure that is going to take place to get it to the final stages. From an ecological restoration perspective, it was a very interesting challenge when the reserve was trying to get going. There was a severe drought in the area, but also there was extensive overutilization of the landscape, just high carrying capacities that exceeded those of the landscape in a situation which is a sort of communal grazing situation. And we can see there the difference in the landscape. Those are pictures from exactly the same place, and not too, from a time perspective, not very different times. So at the end of the winter season and the drought, and then by January that area had recovered, but it was at the end of October that the cattle were taken out of that area, and that area was allowed to rest. There's also been a lot of alien plant clearing. Unfortunately, there's a lot of timber upstream from the reserve, and some of that overflow, the seed bank, has flowed into the reserve, and so it has impacted on the riparian systems. So just looking at the business partnerships and particularly from the community side, what has been set up. The community are paid a lease fee for that land. So that's direct revenue generation for the community trust. As I mentioned, I think it's important that none of the communities who have put in land put all their land in. So it was their choice, and it allowed them to carry on other economic opportunities on the land beyond the reserve. And that is obviously looking at the grazing. So for example, the cattle that were in the reserve could be moved out into the grazing areas around the reserve. And I'll touch on that a little bit more shortly. The profit share agreement has also been established around the tourism business. There's a game ownership agreement where all landowners will be able to own wildlife, even though they haven't necessarily been able to purchase it or bring it themselves. The model at the moment looks at any growth of those animals are apportioned to the landowner percentage and from a hectare perspective. So they will be owning wildlife as well. And there's a preferential employment arrangement with the various communities, so that obviously that's becoming a very important aspect around job creation. And leading on to the employment side, at the moment, and this was as from April, there's 186 permanent employees, 44 temporary employers, and 3 learnerships at play. This is a work in progress. The aim is, well, the need for the reserve will be, from an employment perspective, is estimated to exceed 200 employees. So that's still going to grow. There's still going to be temporary employment, there's learnerships, and community appointments at the moment are between 67 and 70%. And I think one of the things that we found here was the challenge around sourcing people for the diversity of skills that are required by a reserve like this. And so that is creating incredible number of jobs and is now the biggest employer in that landscape. From an economic performance perspective, I think there's been some research that has been done which compares a sort of typical agricultural system to a game ranch, and particularly one that has as diverse sort of tourism model as Babanango does, right from environmental education all the way through to something such as your high-end tourism market. And typically, the game and tourism reserves and models generates approximately 2.5 to 3 times the economic output per hectare of conventional livestock farming. And then further to that is that there are, as I mentioned, far more skills required than in conventional agricultural system. And so that also provides great opportunity for the communities around the protected area to find employment. And that's, unfortunately, it's one of the challenges has been that the level of skills in the surrounding community have not matched the need of the tourism business and the reserve at large. However, the reserve is working on developing those skills, and this is why it's going to be it's a long-term project where through the investment into the surrounding community and the beneficiaries, we can increase their representation of landowners and beneficiaries in the employment than what we see at the moment. So yeah, I think there's a great opportunity for the reserve while transitioning to show that to the communities who have never seen this kind of economy before or been exposed to it, that there are alternatives and real alternatives to just the traditional livestock farming model that has been employed in the area for a while. I think it's important also that this provides ownership of that land. The reserve as it's set up really does, through the fencing, it provides the ownership to the respective landowners. As I said to you earlier, what was happening before was that in the absence of sort of communal, sort of real communal management in a very vast area, there was a lot of people who were grazing their cattle who were not beneficiaries, who were not from that area. So therefore depriving the landowners of a resource and of benefits that they should be receiving. And I think that's important in terms of what the reserve has established at this point. As I mentioned, there's the project through government support, our Alien Plant project, looked to support 40 staff. That has had some challenges, but it is up and running, and we will be restarting that project shortly. It did run for a year. COVID had an impact, and hopefully that gets back on track. And then the infrastructure development grant, it's 20 million rand has been assigned. However, as I mentioned to you, the challenge there has been with government getting that process going, and it has not materialized at this point. And this was the big concern, that the government support was not going to be enough to secure this land in the eyes of the community. They were not seeing the benefits that were going to flow, and therefore it was important to find alternative investment into this project. The philosophy of conservation and our model is around not creating islands, and I think that's a very important process that we've undertaken, and that's why we've partnered with the Meat Naturally project, and we are in a catchment area called the Umfolozi and Umfolozi catchment, where we have been setting up grazing associations. These grazing associations are on the boundary of the reserve. However, there's an additional 9 more that could come online, and that's going to take it up to about 40,000 hectares around the reserve. This project aims to improve the rangelands, improve the economic returns for livestock owners in the communities. And the way that's done is by setting up grazing associations and through Meat Naturally is bringing the market to them, setting up mobile auctions in the communities, getting the buyers to those auctions, and then through that, the grazing associations are able to keep some of that revenue to reinvest in the improvement of their herd health, and also investing in herders. Now, I see that Johan mentioned that one of the talkers is going to be from the Herding Academy. We work with the Herding Academy, who have been training eco-rangers, and there are 6 eco-rangers per grazing association. Their role is to manage the livestock, and most importantly, for the first year, they have been keeping out livestock, allowing areas to rest in the absence of fences, so that there is winter grazing for the animals. They've also been involved in managing fire, so that the grazing is not burnt and removed in winter, so that the cattle still have some food left. Previously, that has been a big issue where fires have started and burnt all the winter grazing, and you get large cattle losses due to starvation. In addition to that is a project around setting up a carbon opportunity, and through improved rangelands, the restoration of those rangelands by the employment by other grazing associations, and them setting up their business, employing the eco-rangers who are in the process of being trained to become professional herders, and they'll be certified as such. We are improving the carbon sequestration of that area, and so there is an opportunity to develop a carbon economy which can assist and contribute to the management of that landscape and additional beneficiation to the communities. So at the moment we have an expanding project around the reserve, and we always say that these projects around the reserve are just as important as the reserve itself. If we do not have these, and we do not create these sustainable economic opportunities outside the reserve, then the conservation is not going to be sustainable either. This just gives you a picture of the landscape. If you look to on the eastern side, so if you're looking at the map on the left-hand side of the fence of the reserve, that entire area is what we call as Ngonyama Trust land. And it's important to just spell that out. And what does that mean in this context for those who don't know the sort of land tenure in South Africa, the land tenure system, is that is actually owned by the Zulu trust, where the Zulu king is the sole trustee. So it's community land. The difference is that the communities who have put land in to the Babanango Game Reserve, they actually own land. They have title to that land, and that's a big difference. And you can see just looking at the map there, you can see the color differential between the reserve area and the outside, and that is because of the excess utilization of that landscape, particularly through overgrazing. And that's what we're trying to improve, so that we aren't left with an island. I just wanted to share an example of other benefits that sometimes go unnoticed. So through the reserve and its establishment, and with the eco ranges, there's been a reduced amount of stock theft. It has been prolific in the area, and that has been reduced. Also, the incidence of fires, as I mentioned, and that will pay dividends to improved livestock and livestock health and returns as well going forward, and also more secure grazing, where people start understanding that they need to protect their grazing from others who are essentially herding their cattle and robbing them of a vital resource, which is grazing, and that's their economy. Secondly, there are about 20,000 community members in a sort of possibly a 10 to 15 kilometer radius around the protected area. So the interest of the reserve needs to extend way past that of the protected area itself. And those benefits we need to flow that in that direction. However, there is a challenge around managing and meeting expectations of communities, particularly those that are not necessarily beneficiaries, but they are neighbors to the reserve area. So I think it's important just to highlight some of the challenges. This is not something that one starts and thinks it's going to be plain sailing. There've obviously been some things that have been thrown in that the whole world didn't anticipate. But since 2018, there was a number of challenges that we've seen, and it's important to note tensions between traditional and political leadership structures. We work very closely with the traditional leadership structures in those areas, but there are political leadership structures as well, and they don't necessarily meet. Tribal factions, I think that's something that would always be in the rural landscapes. Counterland claims, and that's something that the National Department of Land Affairs needs to resolve, that their processes are claimed to be robust in allocating the land, and there shouldn't be any alternative land claims if their processes are robust. But however, there have been counterland claims to those that have successfully land claimed through the restitution process. There's been various political interferences, as you can imagine a huge investment like this. It's going to attract political attention. And obviously crime. crime is everywhere, and it has affected the project. COVID-19, a huge challenge, and I'll talk more on that a little bit further. And then also the passing of the late Zulu king Goodwill Zwelithini left a leadership vacuum, and that might have created some element of political and traditional leadership tension. It's quite difficult to assess that. Social unrest in KwaZulu-Natal, there was a situation where there was severe social unrest, and that also had impacts on the communities and the surrounding towns as well. Government processes, permits and authorizations, you can plan, but unfortunately permits and those government authorizations lie with government, and they are erratic and really make planning very difficult because they are such a variable in the processes. Governance and institutional capacity of community trusts. I think when the national government set up these trusts, it was a convenient vehicle for these systems to be managed. However, there seems to have been a lack of institutional training and building up of the communities to be able to manage the trusts legally in terms of what is required by law. And I think that's something that through this process, the trusts are becoming more empowered, becoming more knowledgeable, and understanding their roles in being trustees, particularly. And I think that's a benefit that has emerged. And as I mentioned, managing expectations. The area that we're working on is only so big and can only do so much. And it might attract more people to the area looking for opportunities, and that exacerbates the expectations that are set. So it's important to manage that. It's important to just keep growing and educating people around an unknown economy. It's sort of proof through doing. That's what has happened to date, and people are starting to see that the benefits are there with the creation of jobs, the investment that is being made, etc. It is a brand new economy, and people are learning. And this is an important case study that we can share in other areas to showcase this, where they have not been accustomed to, particularly a wildlife-based economy. There's a shortage of requisite skills, as I mentioned, and I think that's something that needs to be addressed. We need to identify what skills are going to be required in the landscape through the reserve, through the agriculture and livestock around the reserve, but also all the secondary and tertiary economic opportunities that are there through small businesses, entrepreneurship, etc. And that's something that needs attention. More recently, foot and mouth has constrained the project. It's prevented the introduction of wild animals through the restrictions of foot and mouth in the movement of cloven hoof animals, and that has affected the business model of particularly the reserve side. And sorry, the managing expectations I've touched on already, and then the business development timelines. So all of these various factors have affected the business timelines, planning, and then you throw COVID and all these other things. It's affected the revenue generation potential of the reserve. So there's a lot of opportunities still to work on. The creation of the first community trust strategic development plan. I think that's something that will really work well. It will identify areas of particularly agricultural potential outside of the reserve, will identify different economic zones and help preserve those areas in a plan, and develop economies on that land in a structured way. Also look to secure the reserve as a protected area in perpetuity, and importantly, some of the communities one of the reasons for them assigning the land as into the nature reserve was also for cultural heritage sites to be preserved as well. So it wasn't just for conservation reasons. then to develop additional wildlife benefits. And I'll touch on that shortly. Well, let me touch on it now. The opportunities are particularly from live game sales. There's an opportunity through them owning wildlife. And furthermore to that is the development of a venison production business. And you can see at the bottom of the screen there is a label called Harvest that Conservation Outcomes is working in other parts of the country, is developing a transparent and defensible standard for meat production sourced from protected areas, formerly conserved areas, and that are providing clear ecological benefits, and also then these provide benefits to the communities as well. And so that's a real opportunity that is developing. And research, great research opportunities, and particularly to develop the research skills from the communities and the landowners themselves, and further sustainable economic opportunities, and then expansion of the protected areas. And particularly, there's a real opportunity to develop a mixed use land system where we can have livestock and wildlife grazing. Unfortunately, we have a challenge in South Africa where the laws perhaps limit the ability of some wildlife to mix with livestock, and so that's something that unfortunately is legislators, mainly because of disease, the potential for disease spread to agriculture. So that's a constraint. However, there are other species that can be used in a mixed system, and that's something that we will be exploring on community land as well. So what has helped us to get to this point? I wouldn't say everything's worked. I think it's there's been a lot of learning by doing, but there is a genuine economic opportunity here, and I think the benefits are starting to flow to those surrounding the reserve and those that are landowners. Exceptionally willing investor. I can't emphasize that enough. The investor could have gone anywhere in Africa, but he chose this project because the project was one that was going to have not only conservation benefits, but also leave a legacy of improved livelihoods for those that own the land. And then just also what helped that was COVID to some degree, a little silver lining in that it was during COVID, people were paid salaries. There weren't any layoffs. And so I think that showed people, many people returned to the rural areas from other urban centers, Johannesburg, etc., who had been laid off and were surprised to come back to their rural homes and find that their family members who were employed on the reserve were still in employment in their backyard. And I think that brought some people to understand better the value of this, that this is a long-term project and is able to provide jobs into the future. And as a result, local livelihoods have been changed. I think it was important that this was a vision led by the community. It's not something that was imposed. It was something that certainly one community wanted, and then two others have joined the project as well. So it was community-led. Community trusts have title deeds and they own that land, which is absolutely essential and has been very important in this process. They are the decision makers. Not all land included. So as I mentioned, they have the ability to carry out other economic opportunities on the land outside the protected area, and we are working with them on that. And also there's a relatively small number of beneficiaries, the Mtlagwini being having the most, 198 families, whilst the Mtlagwini community has 67 and the Esibongweni community only 31. And then the partnerships at a local level with government, I think is critical and vital to the success. Working towards province, I think there's still opportunity there, working with the conservation agencies and national government institutions, and then all the NGOs as well that have partnered to make this work. I think it's important to recognize all of them. And then I think it's just having a a multidisciplined team on the ground that have been involved in this project who have really put in a great effort. Many have been there since 2018, and I think the knowledge and skills that have been developed over time have been hugely valuable. And then I just want to end off with some sort of lessons learned, and I think and just some pointers. The survival of wildlife and biodiversity depends on the perceptions and development needs of people living adjacent to and in the vicinity of the parks. And I think that's important. We have to get the landowners and those around these protected areas receiving genuine benefits through the ownership of wildlife, and also not forgetting the economies that they are used to and are so valued in the landscape and their culture. Wildlife can be used to enhance agricultural benefits. I think that there's a real opportunity here where wildlife is a driving economy and people are being employed. There's a lot more opportunities for people to own wildlife, not to own wildlife, own livestock in the rural areas, and also to manage that livestock better through access to better medicines because they can afford it, improve genetics, etc. And then also that the opportunities, as I mentioned, through Meet Naturally have all been derived out of the reserve itself being there. So those are because of the wildlife economy is now translated into agricultural benefits beyond the conservation area. The project has come at an exceptional financial cost. I think that's important. This is not something that that has got to this point through being self-sustaining. It hasn't. It's a big financial investment that will hopefully be self-sustaining, but it won't look to it won't be able to cover its investment costs. The model needs to show that restituted land is an investable proposition. I think that's important. Why this project is so important, and can restituted land owned by communities attract foreign investment? Is it safe? Is it, how great a risk is it to those investors? And I think that's why it's important that this project needs to succeed, or else it has the potential to show that restituted land is too high risk and not necessarily an investable proposition. And that's what we're working towards, to change that. And also by making it a success, create the opportunities in other communities and landscapes. It takes time and patience, and I'm sure many of you will align to that. There's a need to manage wicked problems. We solve one problem, it creates another, and I think it's just one of those things, but it's about how you manage those problems going forward. They're always going to be there. It's how you mitigate those problems going forward, and I think that's something that we are learning. Ensure that it is understood that all social economic benefits that arise from the reserve, from the reserve's presence, is because of the wildlife conservation, the wildlife economy that has been developed there. Multiple partners create strong pillars of support. I can't emphasize that enough. It takes many partners to create something like this. No one entity can do it on its own. And there's a real scope for government to invest in reducing the barriers to developing and expanding the wildlife economy projects that the country has the potential for. Unfortunately, we've got a great strategy, got great policy to do this, but it's at a ground level, the barriers are still there, and it's making it very difficult and reducing the opportunities to show that wildlife as an alternative land use can be a very important player in terms of rural development and benefiting rural communities. And I think that's something that hopefully we can break through the barriers and get to show that this model can work, can bring benefits to communities, and the wildlife economy can be a competitive land use to other forms of agriculture, and not necessarily take away things like the livestock economy, but complement those economic opportunities in the rural landscape. So on that note, that is the end of my presentation, and I could speak for much longer on the subject in terms of the project itself. It's a really exciting project, and I must say I find myself privileged to be part of a project like this. I think it's an exceptionally unique project, and also thank those that are involved in the project and have made it possible as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much. Thank you for so many lessons in conservation and leadership and collaboration, project management, growing the economy. I know this project is not without its problems, but it is certainly what we as South Africans want to strive for when we think about what our country should look like and what we want our country to look like. So thank you for this comprehensive overview. I'm going to hand over to Holly Magog. Holly is my colleague from Kenya. She works both with Shares Green Africa as well as the African Wildlife Economy Institute. And just once again, thank you to the Africa Wildlife Economy Institute for collaborating with us in presenting this series. Holly, are you there for the Q&A?
Thanks, Jan. Chris, that was an absolutely wonderful talk. And like Mark said, and I was very pleased to see that Mark is indeed here, it was a lighthouse project, or is a lighthouse project, I should say. So I actually have the first question from Mark. And I think, Mark, if you're willing to unmute, it would be good that you ask Chris this yourself, because I know you're always prone to elaborations in a question.
Thank you, Chris. A really enlightening project. As a precursor, I do appreciate all the efforts, but unfortunately, I always ask myself, given the image you showed about the degradation of the land, why does it take such immense external investment to halt the degradation, to provoke the insight that a different approach is necessary? And I'd really appreciate if you could elaborate on this maybe quite sensitive topic.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that, you know, as I mentioned, is not unique to this landscape. I think we see it too frequently in many places. And I think one of the challenges that we see is, I think the key issues around land tenure. That who owns the land, having ownership, I think makes it very different. I also think that the sort of robustness of the landowner structures is also a challenge. So, you know, where it's, you know, the sort of traditional tragedy of the commons is what we see in many places, and that's what we see in places where there's not very good. The landowner is not a person that is responsible, is not present, and I think that's the challenge. I do think that there's this is a very, there's not a one answer here. I think you know, we see a failing of other systems as well. I think it's sort of broader things like, you know, people have been forced to take on more subsistence lifestyles as a result of COVID, for example, and that's forced them, you know, into landscapes where are possibly marginal, and they don't necessarily haven't acquired the skills to manage land adequately. We also see the effects of climate change. I mean, those are real, and so I think there's multiple things, and I think to me the whole thing is around education and ownership, and getting people to be responsible for that. And I think that is starting to become a realization and a challenge, a definite challenge, because it's not something that, particularly in traditional landscapes that they've been accustomed to, is taking that ownership. And I think, you know, we found it was quite striking when we found that, you know, some of the livestock grazing that was taking place, people were bringing those livestock, and some of them were running in commercial size herds, 300 head of cattle at a time, just bringing them into a rural community to access free grazing, essentially. And that deprived those people of an important resource. They still had their cattle, but there just wasn't enough food. So I think now that developing the systems to manage that and getting people to take on more responsibility, I think is what we're trying to achieve. But as I say, there's a lot of different challenges at play at once, and things like the COVID situation, etc., economic sustainability, climate change, these bigger things aren't helping.
Maybe Mark can be, yeah, well done.
No, just as a quick follow-up, maybe is there no emotional, cultural, mythical association between the local communities and their land that is sort of beyond economic reasoning?
Yes and no. Yes, because I do think that there are cultural heritage sites that are of value to them, and to be honest, it's still a question that I have, is that the land where the reserve is set up, 20,000 hectares. There's not many places that you'll find 20,000 hectares with there was only 3 houses on the periphery. And not in that landscape. So there must be, there might have been something at play there, but I think that with the younger generations, there's a completely, the sort of change in culture. I don't see that being as strong as it might have been in the past. And I think everyone wants their patch. There's a lot of double sort of housing. You have your rural, and then those that are in the urban have a house there as well. And so those that are, expanding their families in the urban center start building in the rural. So you get these sort of duplication of houses in the landscape. So land is just allocated largely for housing, and then that really doesn't help in structuring other kinds of economy, whether it's agriculture, which needs land, and you get houses being built on viable agricultural land. It takes away those opportunities, and that's why setting up some kind of strategic plan by communities for how do they see their land in 10 years time. And I think getting them to take on a process like that, 20 years time, what do they want it to look like? And I think that hasn't been done at that scale, and it's something that we want to try and drive.
Okay, last question, and I'll shut up. You are clearly leading this effort, or let's say a group around you. Is there a plan to hand over the leadership to the local community and make yourself superfluous?
Yes, that is the plan, and it's kind of as an NGO, and if we didn't have to do this work, it would be fantastic. But yeah, so the idea is to be invested in there, to develop something that's sustainable, and then try and replicate this elsewhere. So yes, that would be the plan, particularly in terms of the surrounding landscape. With the reserve itself, we carry out different kinds of ecological management support there. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the reserve manager is a born and bred person from that area who grew up there, and so yes, that is definitely the objective, is to grow local.
Thank you very much for that, Chris. Now, I have a couple of questions in the chat, and I'm actually going to do them the other way around. So Chanda, I will come to you, but Nkebo came a little bit later, and she is asking about the risks of investing in restituted land. So if perhaps you could just summarize that in sort of on one side and on the other side, and what your project wants to prove, I think that would be a good summary for everyone as well.
Okay. So I think obviously there's been a huge investment by the government in South Africa in terms of purchasing land and handing it over back to the rightful owners. And in that process is that we found that the institutional structures of a trust the legal entity which is assigned the management authority of that land is quite weak. We found that the ability for them to manage that land is very weak, and particularly in terms of not just physical management, but also in terms of managing different factions within that. We found in one area where there was a number of properties that were claimed. It was lumped into a trust, but some of those properties were handed over to families. So the autonomy was to the families and not to the trust in terms of the management, and that created problems. I think also then that, you know, what's happened is that it becomes a political play as well. The government handing over land to people, multiple beneficiaries, it's a large number of people, and I think there's political tension, and it also kind of either can work against traditional leadership structures as well in terms of their jurisdiction. So there is tension that can arrive there. And so all of this, if you don't have proper governance structures to allow for the investment or development of the land owned by or through the trusts. For example, we've got trusts who don't have bank accounts, who can't do business. They're not meeting the legal requirements as a trust, and therefore it makes it very difficult for anyone to invest in those in that landscape. And then it's about, you know, any kind of investment. How is it going to be managed? Are there the requisite skills? All of these things are important, and I think that's where at the moment the project is developing the skills within the trust, building their capacity, building their ability to self-manage better than perhaps what we're seeing in we're working in other landscapes, and other trusts are not necessarily there. So yeah, I think there's definitely an opportunity, but sort of the setting up the capacity and the ability to manage any kind of investment is a challenge in restituted land.
Thank you once again. So Chanda, I'm not sure if you can unmute there, and you've asked a very good question, but I was wondering if you could ask this question out loud if you are able to unmute, and also just to let you know that Johan Bauer is talking on the 4th of October from the Herding Academy. Chanda, are you there?
Hi, yes, I am here.
Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for a great presentation, Chris. Some very interesting work that's been done there. I work in the wildlife economy space in Zambia, and one of the things that came to mind as you spoke about the herding certification was the extent to which that takes into account indigenous knowledge systems, because obviously pastoralism and herding, a lot of this is tied to the culture of the people who are utilizing the land. So when we speak about the certification, for example, I mean, what is that about, and how does that take into account indigenous knowledge systems? Thank you.
Thank you, Chanda. Yeah, and there are some, I know that Naturally, there's some projects that are taking place in Zambia. However, the certification is carried out by the Herding Academy, which is a South African-based organization, and it's certified under South African Qualifications Act. So in terms of how it is conducted, there's two things. One is that it's a learnership. It's a 3-year program, and they enter it and through the grazing associations. We have worked with the communities to set up grazing associations, and there's a chairperson, there's a treasurer, etc. The normal sort of structure of a committee, and the aim is to get them empowered. They will employ the herders over time. The qualification is where there is some classroom time. The Herding Academy comes up and does various modules of training, and that can be focused on herd health, identifying a sick animal, how to treat a sick animal, etc. Looking at grasses, what grasses are good, what's bad, alien plants, how to clear them, etc. So from what I see, at no point does it go against any kind of traditional knowledge. If anything, it's just enhancing their knowledge and their ability to improve the management of the herds that they're looking after under the watch of the grazing association. So it's not anything from external being imposed on them. It is enhancing their ability in situ and under the management of the local people themselves. I think the key though is for the people to the grazing associations to transition from a subsistence mindset to a more commercial one. And just anecdotally, one comment that we had from a youth member in the community was that they were very upset with elders because the elders had such wealth, and the elders were so invested in owning livestock that they weren't generating and realizing that wealth. And the youth were saying that that's depriving them of going to universities, selling livestock to buy, to pay for school fees, etc. And so there's also an intergenerational change, it seems, that is happening, where people want to see that this livestock translates into benefits, not just as a status symbol. So that was quite interesting as well.
Thank you. And I wonder if, Ruan, you want to just add on to that, because you have just written a note here, but you could talk a little bit more on it. Ruan, if you want to unmute.
Thanks a lot. No, I think Chris gave a very good explanation. I just wanted to add to the points about traditional knowledge that the mentorship from experienced farmers and elders in the communities is another part of the Eco Ranger training. So there's the formal SACNAS registration, as Chris was referring to, the formal qualification, but then there's also that knowledge transfer, which is very important as just the general development of those Eco Rangers. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Ruan, for that. Now, we don't have any more questions in the chat, but I definitely have one in terms of the two groups you're working with, Meet Naturally and Harvest. Now, before you had reached the second part of your presentation talking about harvest, my first question would have been, okay, you've got all these cattle, and now you are working to graze them and to raise the profit level of these cattle, because one cow obviously is in better health than lots of cows. And my question would have been, well, how do you bring the wildlife into this as an economic stake for the communities? And then you brought in harvest. So how do you balance these two together, harvest and Meet Naturally? Do they work together, or are they two outside entities that you work with and make links for the community?
Okay, so first of all, Meet Naturally is a commercial organization. Harvest is a brand. So Harvest is the brand of sustainably and responsibly sourced game meat that is sourced from declared protected areas, which obviously conform to certain management requirements. From Meet Naturally is a commercial entity that looks at livestock and also the live sale of livestock through mobile auctions. So that's how the revenue is generated on the livestock side. However, we are working with Meet Naturally in another area, and hopefully it can translate here, is something that is quite exciting and hopefully can be realized, is a mobile abattoir. Because of the regulations in South Africa, the meat regulations, it's difficult. You can't just process livestock and wildlife together in the same abattoir. It's difficult you can't just go and herd wildlife into an abattoir either. So you've got to harvest it in a different way. So yeah, the idea of a mobile abattoir, and it can also serve across different seasons. Obviously the wildlife harvesting season is in winter, where your cattle are at their, in terms of their weight, it's their sort of lowest, and then you can transition into a summer period for livestock and harvest there, and you can take the abattoir to the livestock owners rather than them having to try and foot a bill of transporting livestock directly to an abattoir, which can be off-putting as well. So they can realize money basically from their backyard.
Beautiful, thank you. That does answer my question. And it's interesting having an East African perspective where we do have beef and cattle together. They're obviously not slaughtered together because in Kenya we're not allowed to do that. So is it a government sort of rule not to be able to vaccinate for foot and mouth and things like that, or you are able to?
Well, traditionally, vaccination is supposed to be the last resort. It's, you know, the area is quarantined. You know, cloven hoof animals can be moved in and out, meat restrictions as well, and then until they test and destroy and then basically contain foot and mouth. The current situation is that unfortunately it's rearing its head all over the place. So at the moment they are trying to vaccinate the way out of the situation. I know that sort of close on 200,000 head of cattle livestock have been vaccinated. So yes, it's generally the aim is to contain it and then reduce its spread, and then that area is quarantined until it's under control.
Okay, so that brings me then to another question where I was angling to get to, is that there's obviously veterinary bills associated with the wildlife economy that is trying to not only work with the wildlife and bring tourism in, but be able to have the community grazing cows in different areas that may, of course, abut wildlife areas. So how in all of this does the veterinary bills get covered, or how does the community get educated on veterinary ways of mitigating anything that could come up?
Yeah, so I think there's one of the silver linings of the situation is, again, just that is pressing people to understand why herd health is so important, and not allowing people from outside areas to just bring cattle in. So taking more responsibility for the land is actually has allowed us that, because the threat of foot and mouth is real, and unfortunately it is debilitating to the livestock economy until such time as you can still send animals to an abattoir within the foot and mouth area. There's a whole lot of additional protocols. So there is that side. It has impacted on the economy. It's impacted on the social economy for people who are trying to pay for their wives, the lobola system. They can't bring the cattle to the ceremony to get married. So simple things like this are playing a real important role. And so we have to, I think this is where the government is challenged by the current situation. And then we are working with Meat Naturally to see how do we unlock this in a well-managed way. So operating systems like having a mobile auction, but having a vet present. And then that would be offset through the sale of that livestock by any commission. The Meat Naturally model is that a certain percentage of commission goes back to the Grazing Association to invest in herd health, medicines, veterinary care, etc.
Very nice, thank you. Now, I wonder, Frank, if you have anything to say at the moment, or you'd like to kind of add in or ask any questions, if I ask you to unmute there.
Okay, you unmuted me. Hi. No, let me get my microphone in the right place. Fabulous presentation, absolutely fascinating. I think what the presentation shows is a couple things. One I put in the chat is that, yeah, there are actually ways that we can mix wildlife and livestock in a landscape and look at that whole landscape. And I think that's a big lesson, is that it is, from a landscape perspective, it's not really an either or, but it's maybe for many places, how can we do this together? And the second thing is, it's really complicated. And I think the presentation, Chris, was fabulous to take all the social, the economic, the political dimensions to do this. It's not easy to do. And so I think you've really laid it out well, and it's a type of project that one should really look closely at. I hope you're successful. I wanted to get sort of say, well, what's the downside if the whole thing falls apart? But I hope it doesn't. But it is something that one looks at this type of presentation, says it's doable, but there's a lot of work and there's a lot of dots to connect to make it happen. Well done presentation.
Yeah.
Thanks, and to follow up on that, Chris, I mean, one of the things that I think is something that we've seen in say northern Kenya is crime. Now, crime is always going to be a hindrance to any economy. So anything that can decrease crime in any way is something that is going to uplift any part of an economy. And I wonder how you could talk to, especially here, stock theft being, I'm guessing, your major kind of crime, and how you've kind of come in and made a stand on trying to reduce this, which then allows other businesses to have less hassle with crime.
Yeah, thanks. That's probably a whole nother presentation on itself. Particularly in terms of the livestock situation. To be honest, the area was, when the project started, it was well known because it was quite far out, hidden away, poor access, etc. That everyone warned that a lot of the livestock that you see was probably livestock that was being hidden there. So yeah, I mean, as a result of the sort of taking animals, getting the landowners and the cattle owners together to move the livestock out into the surrounding community areas, and particularly the adjacent landowner grazing areas, I think that took out a lot of the sort of livestock criminal element, because it was sort of they were cleaned out where they weren't able to operate as they used to in that area, and so they were forced to sort of take their illegal business elsewhere. So I think that was one element. I think the other is obviously that the meat naturally thing with eco ranges, I think, has huge potential. Now the big process is getting members of the associations to conform to the legislation where animals are branded. So there's far more active management around the animals than previously. And I think that's something that we saw, that sometimes, these cattle were left to wander. They could have wandered who knows how far, because there's no fences. But they weren't seen for 2 weeks at a time sometimes. And so this is, I think, just improved management, eyes on the cattle, and vigilance. And then, I think also creation of other opportunities is vital. I think it's something that we've seen where people are, the 186 jobs that have been created. I think that's important. People can see now that there's opportunities if they perhaps, work, spend more time in school or whatever it might be. I think there's so many benefits that we and it's something that, I was going to say to Francis, is that we haven't been able to do as well as we hoped, is the research side, is really understanding the impacts of what's happening in the landscape and what has been achieved and what hasn't been achieved. And I think that's one gap that for me is something that unfortunately we're not addressing adequately at this point.
Well, it certainly sounds like there's 100 doors to open into new areas, and also to learn some of what you've already been doing, so to learn the effects of those. So thank you, Chris. I think that was a fantastic presentation. I don't see any more questions, so I think we will call it a day there. So thank you very much.